All right, hi folks, we're back. I'm on to part 2 now of the lecture. All right, I actually had just recorded parts, I just recorded parts 2 and 3 and uploaded them, and it didn't work because with YouTube you can't do any video that's longer than 15 minutes. So I need to keep my clock right here handy and cut this off. I lost a lot of time doing that. Okay, so as I was just finishing saying, anthropology has been heavily influenced by, up until that point, a bias towards males' experience, meaning that men's experience was privileged within the anthropological literature. And it was the second wave movement, feminist movement, that highlighted this very fact. Okay. So I should also just once again repeat that it was through the second wave feminist movement, right, that anthropology was forced to reckon with the ways in which the profession was sexist, but also the ways in which the ethnographic record itself was sexist in that it focused primarily on men's experience. So here's just a fun cartoon. I'm sure, hopefully you can read it. It says, "Hey, I'm the hunter. You're supposed to be the gatherer." That's the male, the caveman, saying that. Cave woman replies, "He was standing on the stuff I wanted to gather." Ha ha ha. Okay, so sharing that because this next little series of slides talks about or discusses women the gatherer and man the hunter. So this was a series of debates that happened in early feminist anthropology that when you read Risaldo, you'll see that she spends a fair amount of time revisiting these debates. So traditionally, anthropologists who looked at hunter-gatherer societies romanticized the role that men took on, that role being that of man the hunter. And the classic argument is that hunting requires complex tools, very complicated communication skills, and so that alongside agriculture and the practice of hunting, which brought in lots of protein to these family groups, humans were able to evolve into more complex social structures. So from small hunter-gatherer clans into eventually chiefdoms that were often headed by men. So you can read between the lines to see the argument is basically saying, well, it was thanks to men that humans evolved into these higher order societies. So as you can imagine, feminist anthropologists and archaeologists working during this time period, the 1970s, have a lot to speak back to in terms of this topic. And they say, well, what about woman the gatherer? So here's a series of images. These are the kind of images that populated 1960s, 70s textbooks, anthropology textbooks, right? You can see that it's showing groups of men that are using tools and skills to hunt dangerous large game. In fact, one of the books I have here is literally titled Man the Hunter, written by Richard Lee, who's a former professor of where I went to graduate school at University of Toronto. So the images that are produced here are obviously androcentric. They're focusing on men and really privileging hunting as important within the hunter-gatherer distinction. So what do feminist anthropologists have to say specifically to this assertion? Well, a lot. One thing they say is that actually gathering and childcare are also complicated skills. Gathering requires that women communicate back to one another and say, where did they gather? Where was the place that they found lots of berries or nuts? No more, no less, I would say, complicated than communicating around how to kill wild game. And of course, childcare also requires incredibly complicated communication skills because they're teaching children how to communicate. They're teaching children language. Cooking is not only a series of skills, but it also requires the creation of particular tools, various tools. And that, alongside basket weaving, shows that women had very complicated and astute an astute set of skills that were just different, but no less important than that man, the hunter, had. Study after study showed and continues to show that women in hunter-gatherer societies were actually the primary breadwinners, in the sense that they brought home more food than men. So if men every once in a while brought in a large wild, deer, whatever sort of big game, anthropologists have actually documented, using quantitative data, those who worked in hunter-gatherer societies measured the amount of food that women would bring in as they gathered versus men. And in fact, most of the calorie intake of a hunter-gatherer family, the vast majority of it comes from that which is provided by women who are gathering berries and nuts and other foraging for other kind of wild food. Patricia Draper is one of these anthropologists who worked in the 70s. She worked among the Kung of Southern Africa. And she showed that Kung women were able to bring in most of the food for families. She also argued that actually the Kung, which were shifting when she was doing research from hunter-gathering societies to sedentary agriculturalists, so they were shifting from being hunter-gatherers to growing crops. She said that it was when they were hunter-gatherers that women actually had more freedom. When they switched over to these more complex system of sedentary society, the women that she worked with, she saw them actually losing kind of privileges and rights. We should also say that women do and did hunt in many societies, but small game, so they are bringing in protein anyway. And this framework really assumes that of male, the hunter, it at times assumes a certain series of sex roles and gender ideologies and that we have today, and puts them upon early hominids. One could also say the same of some of these women the gatherer arguments, that we're taking our ideas about gender and putting them on people that lived in ancient times, right? Or some that weren't even people, if we're talking about hominids. The important takeaway point of all this is that man the hunter, woman the gatherer debates in anthropology were all about, well, I should say women the gatherer retorts were all about addressing androcentric bias in anthropology. Androcentric referring to the practice of privileging male experience over female experience. So much of the male the hunter material and arguments were really about assuming and romanticizing that males' roles or jobs as hunter were more important than that of gatherers, or they were it was a more interesting topic. I'm not sure, but it is very representative of that 1960s, 70s anthropology where warfare and chiefs and tribes and hunting were privileged over other topics that would have been more women-centered. Okay, so I'm going to end this now, and I will see you at the start of part 3.